Ladies and gentlemen, our program is about to begin. Please take your seats and silence your cell phones. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you. I'm Beatriz Gonzalez. I'm president of the Wolfson campus, and it's my pleasure and honor to welcome you here this evening. We are so proud to support the work of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum because we are indeed partners in education for a humane and just world. The Wolfson campus, as you can see, is clearly in the heart of our bustling metropolis, and that makes it an ideal place to talk about the power of people, the things that ordinary people do that make them extraordinary, the things they do out of the courage of their conviction. Tonight, we focus on a particular set of people, women who defied their context, women who supported their local and global brothers and sisters, women who created a new reality of empowerment and independence for the women who came after them, including myself, whose dissertation was on working women. So I think this is going to be awesome, and I know you will too when it's over. And so now I'd like to advance the program this evening by asking Robert Tannen, the Southeast Regional Director of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, to come forward. Welcome, Robert.
Thank you so much, Beatriz, for your warm welcome and for hosting this program tonight. And good evening, everyone. This is the second year in a row that we have co-presented a program here in conjunction with Miami-Dade College, and the museum is deeply grateful for this partnership. In fact, our number one priority is education, which is why our office, the Southeast Regional Office, is based right here in South Florida. And we make it a point to bring the work of our national institution outside of its walls in Washington, D.C., and into the towns and communities throughout America, because our museum truly belongs to all of us. Special thanks to our co-presenters this evening. Again, Miami-Dade College Wolfson campus, to Beatriz and your team, thank you. The Miami Herald, and to Rick Hirsch and his team. They put together a number of vibrant advertisements and a quite descriptive, wonderfully descriptive article just a few days ago, which actually highlighted this program. I'm sure some of you have seen it. Really beautiful article. Thank you so much for that, Rick. The National Women's History Museum, who have been really stellar partners with us on this initiative for several years, and McClatchy, who's VP of News, will be moderating tonight's program. So tonight's program is part of a series that explores challenging questions raised by our latest special exhibition at the museum called Americans and the Holocaust. What did Americans know about the rising Nazi threat? What influenced their responses? And why, if Americans knew so much, didn't rescuing Jews become more of a priority except for those very few who went against the grain to help? More than 5 years in the making, this exhibition fulfills actually a mandate from the President's Commission on the Holocaust that established the museum, namely a directive to give special attention to America's response to Nazism. So tonight, we're going to focus on the range of roles that American women played in the 1930s and 1940s in the United States. The personal stories that you're going to hear and the newsreels and videos that you're going to see explore what was expected of women and how those expectations shifted as an isolationist society began to support and actively engage in the Second World War. So with that, and to guide us in our conversation, I would like to introduce tonight's moderator, Kristen Roberts, who is the VP of News from McClatchy. Kristen worked as the executive editor for politics and the regional editor for McClatchy's Eastern region, including the Miami Herald, the Lexington Herald Leader, and the McClatchy Washington Bureau. She also worked as the national editor of Politico and at Reuters, covering everything from Wall Street to economics to defense and foreign policy. So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome me in joining Kristen to kick off tonight's program with our expert panelists.
Hi, everybody. I'm Kristen Roberts. I am so incredibly honored to be on stage with these two extraordinary women who are going to help us go back in time tonight and look at the roles of American women in the 1930s and 1940s. We're going to review not everything that an entire gender did. We know how impossible that could be, especially in 1 hour. But we're going to look at a few individual stories. We're going to try to tell those stories through pictures that you'll see on screen, through some newsreels and some videos, and also through some anecdotes that we'll share with you over the course of the next few minutes. Let me take a moment here to introduce to you our panelists, because they are so accomplished, they have so much to say, and I couldn't be more impressed with all of the things they've done in their careers. First is Denise Kiernan. Denise is an author, a journalist, a producer. Her most recent book, The Girls of Atomic City, was an instant New York Times bestseller, and it actually deserved to be an instant New York Times bestseller. If you have not read this book, I suggest that you do. It was in 2013 on Amazon's list of the top 100 best books. In 2014, it won the Woodrow Wilson Foundation's award for the best book published in the United States on government politics or international affairs. And Denise is going to share some of the reporting that went into that book with you here tonight. Gretchen Skidmore is the Director of Education Initiatives at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, and she leads the museum's educational outreach. The work that she's doing is taking the great resources of the museum and extending them into communities and classrooms nationwide. Gretchen oversees the creation of many of the museum's educational resources, including some of the groundbreaking content that is in the exhibition that Robert just talked to you about. Thank you both for being here in Miami with us.
Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much.
One note before we jump in. Questions will pop into your mind, and as they do, please use the index cards that were handed to you as you came in. Write down those questions. They'll be passed up to me. We're going to spend about an hour talking with Denise and with Gretchen, and then I'll go to your questions. I'm sure you have a lot of them. I'm looking forward to hearing them. Let's jump right in. I want to start with you, Gretchen, please. Why now? What is the significance of talking about American women's roles in the 30s and 40s now?
Well, I think there's a really important part of the research that was done for our exhibition, which Robert talked about, which is thinking about re-examining some aspects of history, right? What did Americans know about the Holocaust? How did Americans respond to attacks on Jews, to putting Jews in ghettos, to news of deportations to killing centers and labor camps and concentration camps? How did Americans respond to all of that? And by looking at the answers to those questions, we knew that we had to not just look at what these people said about those events on the screen here. Leaders at the highest level have often written the history. So what we're trying to do is tell a more complete view of American history, look at the different layers of government, look at the public, and look at opinion as much as we can of average Americans, and certainly women are part of that. So we have to really think about underrepresented voices, and we really tried to do that as part of our research. We wanted to look at women who had agency and resilience, and we wanted to do it recognizing that there were a lot of expectations that were on them at the time that didn't make it easy, right? So this next clip is our beginning into reminding people a little bit the context of the 1930s.
Housekeeping still remains the most important business of the world. Each woman faces it single-handed. She must know how to cook. She must must know how to set her table attractively. She must know clothes, how to buy and how to make them. She must face death to bring children into the world. To her husband, she must be a companion, a sweetheart, a wife, and a mother. She must stir his ambition, pull him through failure, and keep success from hurting him.
What do you want for supper?
Whatever you give me will be okay. You're running the house.
Yes, but I'm running it to please you, dear.
It never gets old.
I could watch that clip a million
Oh,
times. Denise, your book is fascinating. Can you help our audience understand what brought you to this topic and why frame it in the context of women's contributions?
It really snuck up on me, that book, and sometimes I think those are some of the best stories. I was working on a completely different project and was having one of those rabbit hole days, a click-through day. And I just couldn't focus, and I'm sitting there in front of my computer, and suddenly I'm looking at the Department of Energy website, which is, I'm sure, where all of you end up when you're getting distracted on the internet. And they had this history newsletter, and in the corner was this, I think, gorgeous photo. And at first I was just attracted to the photo itself. And then I read the caption, and it says, "These young women, many of them recent high school graduates from rural areas in Tennessee, are enriching uranium for the world's first atomic bomb, but they do not know that, and many of them will not find out for years to come," or something along those lines. And I was like, let's put this aside over here, and what is this about? And as a journalist, you know, one of the first things you ask yourself is this really a story, or is this just a gap I have? Maybe I was asleep that day in history class when they were talking about high school girls enriching uranium, but, you know, I started talking to people, and it became very clear that my view up to that point of the Manhattan Project, the top secret project that resulted in the world's first nuclear weapons and nuclear energy, my view of that project was like most people. It was very top down. Gretchen was talking about
The scientists.
the big three. It was scientists in a room in New Mexico. And I thought so much of history is told in that top down fashion, from the perspectives of the people who held all the cards, who were making all the decisions, who knew what was going on. And when you're talking about something as significant as the development of nuclear weapons and nuclear energy, or any moment in history for that matter, don't we deserve the whole story? And I just sort of became, you know, obsessed. There were thousands upon thousands of people of color, people from economically disadvantaged backgrounds, women certainly, who were a part of this project and other parts of the war. And I just became obsessed with the idea of telling that story, framing that story, as you said, just through the eyes of one of the girls sitting on one of those stools, somebody who literally just walked out of her parents' house. And, you know, what did the Manhattan Project look like to her?
If I were your editor, I would have been so happy that you fell down that rabbit hole.
Yeah.
What an extraordinary book resulted from that. Gretchen, we just watched a clip about women's roles. Bring us back to that moment in the 30s and 40s.
Right, because we also had to do this for the exhibition, right, to remind people sort of the context that people are operating in when they're making these choices. And I think it's just a good reminder that women had just gotten the vote. So we're talking about a time where really only 10 years earlier couldn't even, go to the polls. So there's that, plus, say, 65 million women in America at the time. Of 11 million of them are working. Of that 11 million, 2 million are domestic servants of some kind, right? So the work that we're doing is really represented in this image. It is about cleaning and cooking and running homes. And if you think about the rest of the workforce, half of that number were teachers, and a quarter of that number were nurses. So that's not surprising maybe, but I think to remember that 98% of the engineers in the United States were male. 97% of the lawyers in the United States were male. So when you think about what we're going to talk about tonight and the way that women sort of stepped up not only in the war industry but into activities that were about rescuing Jews and responding to the plight of persecuted people in the world, this context really makes it even more extraordinary, I think. And also, society expected a certain thing of them, and I think this poll is really important to show that at a time when the United States had economic difficulties, right, the Depression starts in really 1929, but has different spikes in the 1930s. This is 1936 when there was an additional recession. High unemployment. Should a married woman earn money if she has a husband capable of supporting her? And 82% of the country said no. So the shift that we're going to talk about tonight, when you see women in factories and secretly, creating war effort type work, I didn't say that very well, but I just don't want to keep repeating uranium because that's so scary. But, like the idea is really about a shift.
Yeah.
And such a profound change. And Denise, let's walk into that part of this conversation. What was American society and American culture telling women about how they should behave, about what their roles were, what was expected of them?
Similar, as Gretchen was saying, the shift is all the more remarkable because of where we started. So those women that I saw sitting on those stools who were working in a factory and earning their own money and enriching uranium at a young age, they grew up being told months earlier, they were being told, learn how to cook. If you're lucky, you will have a good husband. Do not stray far from home. Make sure you look nice. All of those same sorts of things. Dot, this one young woman I interviewed, her family wanted her to join, marry so that they could join farms. Celia, who I just adore, she grew up in a coal mining town in Pennsylvania. Her parents were immigrants. They wanted her to not just marry within their culture, but also stay close enough so that she could be a part of supporting the extended family. Because again, we're still coming off the Depression and money was scarce and families really stuck together to kind of get through those times. And she ended up relying on her older brothers to try and talk, sense into her parents to let her get a job. Jane, Gretchen mentioned 98% of engineers in the country were men. Jane Greer, brilliant young woman I interviewed, and she wanted to be an engineer. She wanted to study at the University of Tennessee, and she was standing online. You used to physically stand on a line to go up and, register, and she was at the School of Engineering, gets a tap on the shoulder, and this man says, "What are you doing here?" And she said, "Well, I'm registering, for the School of Engineering." He said, "We don't let girls study engineering." And she said, "But I have these grades," and she had letters over it. She's brilliant. "Oh, that's very impressive, young lady. We don't let girls study engineering. You can go study statistics," because that was close to maybe bookkeeping or secretarial work or something. And she just fumed. And when I'm telling you, I interviewed this woman in her mid-80s, still fuming. Still fuming, and good on her. And that's her back at the University of Tennessee. But yeah, so they, the expectations on them prior to the war were stay at home, stay at home.
We don't often think about Americans, let alone women, really, who acted on behalf of persecuted Jews in Europe. Why don't we?
Well, there were not a large number of them, but we uncovered them in the research. But it's also really going against the grain of American society at the time. There was a sense that the United States should not be involved in the affairs of another sovereign nation. Never mind the fact that there are heavy racist elements in our society. There are heavy xenophobic elements in our society. This is actually 1926, a call out for a rally of the Ku Klux Klan in Miami, obviously calling for white Protestant America to dominate. And there's widespread anti-Semitism. So to not be worried about a small minority group of Jews in another country, that was the majority of our country really thinking that way. This is it's very hard to find outward displays of anti-Semitism from this period. It was in the midst of people's conversations, but this was in a magazine actually that was published in Clermont, Florida, that was by a sort of pro-Nazi organization that existed in the United States called the White Front. And if you look at the stereotypical image of a Jew in the middle, and it's an octopus reaching out and trying to control finance and agriculture and industry and government. So anti-Semitism, racism, xenophobia, and anti-immigration sentiment on top of that meant that people who decided to go abroad were really an exception. One last image here from Miami in 1942, an ad for the Broadmoor catering to a Gentile clientele. So making it clear that this would be a location that you could go and not encounter Jews. So how do we take that kind of context for people and then think about the choices that they may have been presented with to actually make a difference in the lives of people who are persecuted elsewhere?
In such an isolationist,
Exactly.
such an isolationist atmosphere. I mean,
Right.
it makes
we don't want to
what-
get involved.
Right, exactly. We have enough going on here. You know, I have to take care of things here.
And the
Yeah.
economy was so struggling at the time that they were under their own stresses, no question. There was 25% unemployment in the United States in 1933. So there are things that are real in the lives of Americans that are making it, much more difficult to, really look up and care about people in another place.
And what was the polling showing us?
Yeah. So let's see if we can show the first one. Do you think the United States should declare war on Germany and send our army abroad? To Denise's point about isolationism, 93% no. We're not getting involved in this war, right? World War I was terrible. We don't need to get involved in this mania in Europe. We're out. And the second one is, since we have an idea, especially after 1938, when there was widespread news coverage of attacks on Jews in Germany and annexed Austria, do you approve or disapprove of the Nazi treatment of Jews in Germany, which had gotten a lot worse by this time? 94% said that's really bad. But should we allow a larger number of Jewish exiles from Germany to come to the United States to live? 72% said no. So our anti-immigration sentiment is reflected in these polls. So we have data to show that there were just a lot of people who would rather stay uninvolved.
But the disconnect to me is remarkable.
Right.
It's so clear that there were so many people who really knew that something very, very just horrific was going on, but yet I'm not going to do anything about this right now.
And wouldn't we say that's still an enduring question, right? Which is, when does concern turn into action? When does knowledge convey into action? And in this period, it didn't carry over. There were a lot of reasons for that.
And that's the underlying theme of so much of what we're talking about
Right.
here. Gretchen, let's stay with this as a topic, and let's talk about some of the women who went against the grain and did something. Who were the exceptions?
Well, so let's talk about one in government and one not in government.
Okay.
So one of the most exciting people to talk about in this period was Edith Norris Rogers. She was the first woman elected to Congress from Massachusetts. She served for 35 years. So an interesting moment, right? That she's got this opportunity. She took the seat of her husband who had died. So she immediately goes to work. When she gets there, she's authoring legislation that is about veterans' rights from World War I. She is the one to put forward the idea that women should work in non-combatant roles in World War II, so she's behind the Women's Army Corps, the WACs. She also is one of the first people to denounce Nazi racial policies in Congress. She does this, in ways that are really unique. And part of that effort, she really put together a bipartisan bill with Senator Wagner, who was a Democrat, to try to get young Jewish children out of Europe. 20,000 would come to the United States, they proposed, outside of our restrictive quotas. So she's proposing legislation consistently that is on behalf of these people who are struggling. This is a picture of her with Senator Wagner, and Helen Hayes is in the middle because she came to the hearing. And they are caught up in the public opinion of the time. The bill doesn't make it out of committee. There's a lot of resistance to it, and it never gets to a vote. But she is well known for many of these actions. We just met a scholar who's going to write a biography about her, so she deserves it, right? She's an outlier.
Let's talk about Jane.
So we have one other person who's not in Congress. Okay, this is our second favorite story of our exhibition, I would say, for me personally. On the right, Marianne Winter. She is a 16-year-old girl in Vienna, and she has a pen pal. And she is shown here on the left. She's a similar age, I think she's 15 here, Jane Bomberger, in 1938. And they're writing back and forth. They're just having, conversations about their lives. They had been connected through this organization. When the Anschluss happens in Austria, she realizes, along with her family, Marianne, that things are getting much worse. In this time, it is very difficult to get an American visa. It is also really difficult, partly because you have to get somebody in the United States to say that they vouch for you, that there's an affidavit of support, right? That you won't become a burden on the country. And so she writes to somebody that she knows in the United States, her friend Jane. And she says, now look at the letter that we have. This is a quotation from it. Now I ask you, my dear, this is to her friend, if it would be possible for you to get a connection with any rich man who would be able to give us an affidavit. So Jane doesn't know any rich men, so she goes to her father and she says, can you help my friend and her family? And despite the fact that he's not very wealthy, we see in the documents that indeed they supported the transfer or the transport of this family, the ship tickets. This is the affidavit of support. And if we could zoom in, this is really, really significant. It's not just bringing over Marianne Winter. It's Max Winter, her dad, who's 45, Anna Winter, her mother, who's 45, Stefan, her brother, and then Marianne. And they actually are able to come because this one family supports them. You can see that Joseph Bomberger signs off here as the person who will be the supporter of this family. They meet them at the boat, and the girls and the family help each other out. We have a picture of them from the newspaper after they've arrived. So notice, this is interesting because in the write-up of it, and Kristen, you might have already noted this, they don't use their names because they're still afraid of what might come to other relatives in Germany at the time. So the Red Eagle covered it, and it's just one story showing that to make a difference, there were opportunities, and it was really remarkable that we found some examples of that.
It's so easy to feel powerless when you're faced with such tragedy and difficulty, and you just think about these two young girls. I had a pen pal when I was a kid, and you're writing about what you're doing in school, and I got a dress, I like a boy, whatever, and then all of a sudden,
it's real life.
Then it gets very real very quickly.
Yeah.
And yet she figures out a way to act within, her limited world as a very young girl, and it's amazing. It's amazing.
And we were talking about that before we came on stage, about how compartmentalized everyone's experience was, and
Yes.
that really fits into this overall view. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. I want to shift the conversation and talk about women's roles now. So from what some individual women were doing that went against the grain of public sentiment to the roles. Because it's really so very interesting to me to hear about women and even girls finding ways to act in a challenging time. Let's look at some polling, because in 1939, a poll shows that 37% of the American population was in full support of women working outside the home. But as time progressed into the early 1940s, as the war broke out, things began to change. A 1941 poll shows a jump to 68% of Americans being in favor of women working. And women began to be recruited to join the war effort at all levels. Let's take a look at some of the recruitment efforts that are captured in these newsreels across the country.
The Axis believed it was ready for us. Axis statistics, careful and accurate, had forecast this Army, this Air Force, this Navy. But in the production estimate, the Axis was wrong.
Abeline, have you ever considered the possibility of woman labor? American women?
the call came clear. Wake up, Miss America. Wake up, Mrs. America.
Millions and millions of women who had never lifted a finger outside their own homes now suddenly resolved to set the world house in order.
This is like punching holes in a tin of scouring powder. Instead of cutting out dresses, this woman stamps out the patterns of airplane parts. Instead of baking cakes, this woman is cooking gears.
Two-thirds of the jobs in defense industries can be done by women today. And officials of the defense program are advocating more extensive job training for women and girls. This woman is a modern pioneer, a scientist. She symbolizes the tremendously important work of women.
Many of these women came from walks of life not previously considered. The mothers, the young, the aged. When they were asked why they had joined the ranks of the hidden army, these women gave a variety of reasons.
I had a son on the Arizona. That's a good enough reason for anyone.
I have a family of 10 million to look after. I send them cases of these every week to help them to get home soon.
I go to college, but I arrange my classes so that I can help out in the war effort. This way I'll get my diploma and war bond.
Do you have to have a reason? We're in a jam, aren't we? I'm sorry, but you'll have to excuse me. I'm too busy to answer damn fool questions like that.
Without the help of additional thousands of women, we cannot build the mountains of materiel consumed in global invasion. We cannot make good the millions of man-hours and woman-hours that are lost in a fleeting second smoke and flame. As long as the Nazi cancer exists anywhere in the world, this is also a woman's war, to be waged so that no woman shall ever again clutch a starved baby to her breast, so that no woman anywhere shall ever be the slave of a fascist state that makes her no more than a brood mare. That is why the women of America, like the men at their side, must flock to war jobs and stick to their jobs until that day when an end has come to the devastation of the earth.
Women have always been the guardians of the home and the children, the future of our country. And they are determined that our democracy shall survive and that our precious freedoms shall be preserved.
Those damn fool questions. Quick note, just a reminder, if you have questions, please jot them down on those index cards. We're getting ready to start sending those up. And also, if you're tweeting or posting on Facebook or any other social media about this, please use the hashtag AskWhy and the hashtag USHMM. Denise, let's talk about what these clips reveal. Some really important changes taking place regarding women in the workplace. Tell us about Oak Ridge, Tennessee.
So a markedly different clip compared to the first one we saw about from McCall's with the women in the workplace. I love this image. This is a Norman Rockwell image off the cover of the Saturday Evening Post, because to me this really captures the multiplicity of roles that were suddenly available to women. This was a transformative moment in the history of women's work in the United States of America. And this is Rosie to the rescue, he called it. And if you see this, she's got a nurse's cap. She's going to punch her ticket for because she's a bus driver. She's got a compass. She's got a wrench. She, of course, has her watering can and her hoe because she's got to plant her victory garden. And she also still, and I think this is what's interesting, there's still milk on her hip. So in addition to all of these new expectations, these expanding roles, she's still responsible for the home. The gardening, the food, all of that. So it just really, this one image, and just striding forward, like it's a new world for her. So to set the stage for Oak Ridge, this is about 25 miles outside of Knoxville, Tennessee, between 56 and 58,000 acres. And this is a place, to give you an idea of how quickly things ramped up in some areas of the United States. This didn't exist, in 42, between late 42 and mid 45. Suddenly there are 80,000 people there, using more electricity than New York City, and not on a map. This plant, where Colleen worked, largest building on the planet. So when you think of the number of bodies that were needed to fill all of these roles, it's almost incomprehensible, but of course not just factory jobs. I mean, this was a functioning city. You had people living there, you had to have hospitals, you had to have schools, you had to have cafeterias, there was, recreation. So the recruitment effort was staggering. They would literally like wander the halls of high schools, recruiting women coming out of class. Colleen, who went there as an example of entire families would uplift their lives. She already had an aunt and an uncle and cousins working there, and she and her mother and 9 members of her, that was her brothers and sisters, it was a big family. They all picked up and went and lived in a double trailer at a construction camp in Oak Ridge because her brother was away fighting. So it was amazing, just the sheer numbers in such a compressed amount of time that just kind of mobilized. Once the call went out, women, this is what we need you to do now.
So when you were interviewing these women, doing this research for what turned into this wonderful book, what did they say about their feelings of being involved in this effort?
It's interesting because we're all sitting here and we have the benefit of hindsight and historical perspective and hear how the roles shifted over time and what it means. These women, again, had grown up with that first clip about what was expected of them. So they didn't see anything special about how their roles were shifting and what they meant to the workforce. In fact, when I was early on in my research and I was trying to track down, I was physically driving over there and tracking down people who had lived and worked in Oak Ridge during World War II. Almost every single time I asked a woman if she would be willing to be interviewed for this project, they just would look at me and say, "Oh, you don't want to talk to me, I didn't know anything." What did I, just completely, just years of just devaluing what their role was. And even so many years later, after, they learned about, they were involved with the Manhattan Project and World War II and all of these things, to them it was just, this was, what did I do? And to them it was this sense of duty. And it's hard, I think, and I would like to think a better understanding of it while I was working on the book, to understand the impact that war had on absolutely everyone in the United States of America. I mean, you could not escape the war. It was on all the songs on the radio, comic strips, Superman had something to do with World War II. You went to scrap metal drives, you went to USO dances, you volunteered at the Red Cross. And there was this idea that whatever your part, you should do your part. And so you have these sort of combined, the films like the one we just saw, telling women we need you, combined with this real sense of duty to do something, but at the same time, just like zero ego about it. Just this is what's being asked of me, and this is what I'm going to do.
Gretchen, bring us to Florida. And how did women in Florida respond and participate in the American war effort?
I mean, it's so interesting because it's so similar, right? Like Oak Ridge is an example of what was happening not only in Tennessee, but in North Carolina and in Florida and in Oregon. There were places all across this country, as Denise said, that get involved in this. We pulled some articles from our research just to show some examples of the engagement of women. This is in the Pensacola News in 1942, and I just want to highlight this line. It's about American women adapting themselves to the war effort, exactly what you're talking about. And notice the line in the middle there where it says, "In one end of the building and at the other end, 3 women, creatures of luxury and leisure 6 months ago, were welding with acetylene, handling the welders with as much facility and dexterity." So they're recognizing this shift in this article. We also have interesting article about the universities and how they were training women to be ready for this work. So this is from the Tampa Tribune. University of Tampa appointed, people to do special training programs for women. This happened at the University of Florida as well. And as Denise said, there's a lot of pride in this work, and this next little piece from one of the newspapers in Key West shows that they're using the concept of women's work in an ad, but it really reflects that, you know, women, they make good everywhere. And I feel proud of that when I see that. You know, they felt proud of their work. Women wore workers and wax, and that's who they're talking about. And they're there in their uniform. Never mind the ad part of it, but just the idea, right? That means if they use it in an ad, it's going to resonate with people, right?
Right. So this is a reflection of the mood of the country.
Right.
Yeah.
To be proud of that. And finally, just in the last clip here, the idea that we have a lot of opportunity to get women involved by selling bonds, by raising money for the war, and certainly that was another area. But all of these articles, by the way, come from this research project that was part of our initiative for the exhibition called History Unfolded, and we have a call out to you all to help us, continue to help us with this. We're actually having people look at microfilm and upload images to our database so that we know how Americans were responding to events all across the country. And those articles were all submitted by what we're calling citizen historians, people who looked in the local press. And of course, we have a lot of articles from the Miami Herald, and you know, we'll hear more about that too. So,
well, yes, as we were preparing to come together for this conversation, the museum and our co-participants, our co-sponsors of this event, as well as the Miami Herald, put a call out to the community for stories. We ran ads digitally and in print asking for the stories of women here in South Florida who participated in some way. And Rick Hirsch, wave to everybody please, who is our managing editor at the Miami Herald, his team worked very hard on this, and we ran a story just this week. And some of the stories will also be featured in the Miami Herald's Flashback Miami series. And I want to share one of those stories with you in particular. It's a story of Judy Gilbert Gould. We interviewed her last week? Last week, yes? Okay, I think we interviewed her last week. And at 90 years old, she recalls her mother who participated in resettling refugees, in attending to soldiers who came through Miami. Her mother's name was Martha Myers, but let's listen to Judy's words.
My mom, as in, you know, if I could set the setting for those days, wives were wives in those days, but she became involved in a number of organizations on her own. One was she continued with the National Council of Jewish Women, became its president, and it was the council that became the local agency for resettling any and all refugees who came to Miami. She became president of NCJW, and at the same time, she became involved in what was then known as the Jewish Welfare Board, which has now become Jewish Community Services of South Florida. And she became involved in an organization called the Bureau of Jewish Education, which is now the Central Agency for Jewish Education. You know, all of the names change, obviously. When World War II started, she became a volunteer for the American Red Cross. And I remember vividly her dressed in her Red Cross uniform with her hat and the Red Cross pen, going to Miami Beach to the USO to serve refreshments to the soldiers and to roll bandages for those who were hurt. Many of the hotels on Miami Beach had been turned into centers for those returning soldiers who were recovering from their wounds.
You know, it's just extraordinary to hear these stories, to read some of the stories that have come in from you and other members of our community. When you set it in the context of the anti-Semitism that Gretchen described for us, and the polling that we were all able to see, and the ads of the KKK and sort of Nazi sympathetic organizations in Florida, to think that there were so many people who felt that they had agency to do something here in Florida in the midst of all that is, again, extraordinary and has profoundly impacted me as I've read some of these stories coming in. Let's talk more Denise, about personal agency. Can we dig into this issue? Why don't you discuss the environment at Site X, for example, and the motivations of the women who went to work there?
So it's, especially when you look at some of these film clips, it's really easy to feel the, excitement. We're going to work and it's, look at us, we're part of the team, we're doing our part. It was hard. It was difficult. These women often found themselves in incredibly challenging situations that they never thought they'd find themselves in. Oak Ridge, for example, also called Site X, built so quickly, constantly just filled with mud, crowds. They never expected the project to get as big as it did. Houses going up, people would say they'd leave for work in the morning, come back, and there would be 10 new houses on the street because they would just come in and bulldoze land and drop prefab houses that had arrived on train cars. And you have a young woman who, again, expected to basically, marry someone and join farms, all of a sudden, like, being uprooted from her home alone and sent to this completely strange new place. And they found ways still to contribute and to do what they could. And, for some of them, especially in Oak Ridge, there was a tremendous amount of secrecy throughout World War II, right? Loose lips sink ships. You shouldn't talk about things. If you knew where your son, was, going to be stationed, you shouldn't talk about it. You wanted to keep secrets. And that was just to a whole other level for the Manhattan Project. And Celia, who we saw earlier, she takes a job in New York City working for the government, and she didn't know she was working for the Manhattan Project. She gets called into her boss's office one day, and he says, "We're moving headquarters, would you like to come?" And she says, "Oh, thanks, for the vote of confidence, where are we going?" He goes, I can't really give you a lot of details about that. It's going to be in the South." She said, "Okay." They were in New York City. She said, "What am I going to..."
New Jersey.
So, yeah. So she goes, yeah, exactly. Are we going to the shore? She said, "Well, what am I going to be doing?" "Well, it's similar to what you're doing here, but it might, we might change that." "Okay. How long am I going to be there?" "Well, maybe 6 months, maybe 9. It depends." "Okay. If you're not going to tell me where I'm going, how would you like me to get there?" And he said, "Don't worry about it." She was living with her sister and her sister's husband at the time. "We're going to send a car to your sister's. Someone's going to pick you up, take you to the train station. Tickets will be there. Someone on the train will tell you when to get off. And then another car will be there to take you to your final destination." And she says, "Okay." Now, I'm thinking this is the beginning to like a bad Criminal Minds episode. And, don't get on the train. What are you thinking? And this is a woman growing up in a very, very sheltered environment, told not to leave town. And she is getting on a train to nowhere because of this perfect storm of, financial impetus, duty, and love. And she told me, the day that I got on that train that same month, one brother was off to the Pacific and the other was off to Italy. And I had to do something, and this was something I could do. So if my sacrifice was not really knowing what I was doing, I was going to act, to the best way that I could. And I think when we, you talk about the Jane Baumbergers and, the Edith Rogers, all of these people facing their own challenges. Edith Rogers is like the first woman in that seat, and, Jane, a young girl, they still found ways to bring the best of themselves to the situation in which they found themselves. And, if we all did that, I think we'd be in a better situation.
When you all read the book, you will also learn about the great shoe scene when she
Oh,
gets
my
off
goodness.
the train.
Yes.
I'm not going to derail us. Please read the book.
Yes. Those of us who love shoes, it's quite a scene, yes.
So one thing we haven't talked about is another thing that was just ever present in society in this moment, and it's segregation, because the experiences of African American women and men were so very different from those of white women and men during that period of time. Can you talk to us about some of those overlooked experiences, Denise?
Absolutely, and this was, to me, one of the parts of the book that I wanted to make sure we got stories involving the African American community in Oak Ridge. Oak Ridge was completely segregated because you think about this entire population of people, again, giving their time, giving their efforts, giving their energies to the war, and yet still being, you know, having to live. Katie Strickland and her husband, who Katie I interviewed for the book, were not allowed to live together. They were not allowed to bring their children with them to Oak Ridge. Katie lived in what they called hutments, so did her husband, 16-foot by 16-foot structures, mostly plywood. She shared it with about 4 other people. I think we have a picture of the hutments that we could show. And she was not allowed, there were curfews. She was not allowed to visit with her husband, except under, you know, there were certain times of day you were allowed to visit. She hated the food. And she was just determined. And you know, you know this, I mean, as a journalist, you want to get the story. When you are getting a difficult story, and I'm sure you guys go through this too, you want to get the whole story because it's important that it's told, but you're sitting down with someone asking them to go into more and more detail about what was a really difficult time in their life. And I was very fortunate that Katie wanted to make sure that people understood what the African American experience was like in Tennessee. And I said, you know, honestly, why did you go? And she said she knew people who were fighting in the war, and that was important to her, but she said the money we were offered was more than twice the best wage I could get back home in Auburn, Alabama. But as to, these are her biscuit pans in case anybody's wondering what she's holding up there. So Katie hated the food. They weren't supposed to cook in the hutments because they were mostly made of plywood. And she talked to somebody who was doing some construction work and was just tossing aside these pieces of metal while he was welding. And she said, please make me biscuit pans. And she said he was a total stranger. I thought he would think I'm crazy. 2 days later, she goes back to work, and this guy has made her 3 biscuit pans. So she gets all the gals together in her area. They figure out a way to lean these pans up against the potbelly stove in the huts. They get their ration coupons together, all this stuff, and she makes amazing biscuits. And then she starts using the biscuits to bribe the guards to let her spend as much time with her husband whenever she wanted.
No, and these are the actual.
One of my, hands down, my favorite story in that
These
book.
are the actual pans.
Those
right?
are the actual pans. I
she
interviewed Katie when she was about 94, and she was still cooking biscuits every Sunday on those pans for her family. Yeah.
You know, Gretchen, it's really hard to have a conversation about women, American women in the 30s and 40s, without talking about Eleanor Roosevelt. In fact, it's not only difficult to have this conversation without talking about her, it's kind of irresponsible to have this conversation without talking about Eleanor
and
Roosevelt.
very unpopular.
So,
yeah.
where did the First Lady use her power and influence and access?
You know, it's so interesting in putting this little moment at the end of our conversation here, towards the end, is that she's present in all of these areas that we've talked about, right? She was a true humanitarian. She went places where her husband couldn't go or wouldn't go. She was certainly an advocate for African Americans. I grew up in West Virginia. She advocated for coal miners. She was looking around the country for ways that she could make a difference, and she was very involved in the refugee crisis. She saw that as just as much a part of the war effort. She spoke out for the Wagner-Rogers bill that I talked about. She later got involved in the United States Committee for the Care of European Children, and they ended up bringing some kids over in 1940 some were British, some were Jewish, and then ultimately stays involved. She goes to Japanese internment camps, check out conditions, and here she is visiting the one refugee shelter that we created in this country in upstate New York in 1944 to raise awareness of that effort and to make sure she was aware of what was happening there at the refugee shelter. She goes on to work at the UN. So again, a true humanitarian that I think all of us can find inspiration from.
Before I get to this beautiful pile of questions, so thank you to everyone, I want to talk about polling. I want to talk about this poll that I hope we can put up on the screen, because between 1940 and 1945, the female percentage of the U.S. workforce increased from 27% to nearly 37%, and by 45, nearly 1 out of every 4 married women worked outside of the home. And yet a poll in 1944 shows that over 80% of the population believed women who held wartime jobs should lose them as men were coming home to take those jobs back, with some caveats. And in 1945, 50% of the population believed the women's place, a woman's place, was in the home. How do you think about this, Gretchen?
So there's one additional statistic that should always go with those polls, I think, and that is that there were 13 million men coming back from the war, and in 1947, 8 million of them applied for unemployment through the Veterans Administration. So there was a need for jobs for returning veterans, and there was also just a sense that the normalization of society would come about through this restructuring of the nuclear family, where there was security and I think just a sense of normalcy that came from not redoing the family, but keeping it as it had been. And that carries across. I know, Denise, it's a little different for the Oak Ridge women because that was a unique set of jobs and skills.
It was
right?
actually very, it was quite interesting because Oak Ridge was not a factory that had been retrofitted to serve the needs of the war, and then that factory was going to go back to making whatever it was making prior, pots and pans or, whatever they were doing. The jobs at Oak Ridge that many of these women filled and the structures there and the infrastructure there didn't exist prior, so they had not taken anyone's job, filled anyone's position. There was not anyone coming back specifically for that position, and also they were trained to do very specific things that it would take a lot of time to retrain a brand new person, male or female, to do. So as World War II led to the Cold War, we see a woman with a very old version of a Geiger counter here. A lot of the women who were working in Oak Ridge had the opportunity to stay on in their positions, which I think is definitely not the norm,
right?
and definitely an exception.
Yeah.
But for a lot of the women I interviewed, they were very happy about that because, they had gotten that sense of economic independence and they had felt so incredibly valued in a number of different ways.
So the first question is actually right along these lines. Did the women who took wartime jobs understand that they would lose those jobs to men after the war? Was there an expectation that this was temporary?
I don't think so. I really don't. Or if they're, with so many of the women I talked to because I would have conversations about this topic sort of as we all do, not necessarily with the people I was interviewing, but just, people I would meet. And, for some women, Jane actually, who, wanted to be an engineer, she had a very high profile job in Oak Ridge. And when the war was over, she wanted to go raise a family. But it was her choice, And but for some of the women who had outside of Oak Ridge that had really jobs that really meant a lot to them, they wanted to stay in those jobs, but they also did not want to keep a job from someone returning from the war. So I did talk to some people. There was a little bit of conflict there about they did feel like you said, that number of people coming back who, had been away fighting and, wanting to make sure that, there were jobs for them too. But yeah, I don't think the expectation was there that after giving so much, they would say, oh, we don't need you to give anymore.
Second question, again, along the same theme. We talked a little bit about the exceptions for some women who worked at Oak Ridge, but what exceptions existed beyond that of women staying in the workforce after the war was over, Gretchen?
Well, there were fields of science. We've also done some research into a lot of the work of women who were involved in code breaking, for example, who carried that work over into other, because as Denise said, during the Cold War, there were other sort of military-related positions that were needed for the security of the country. There were also some of the more positions that were more traditional that people went back to, but maybe with a different field or with a different focus, in teaching and in some of the community work.
The next question, were women conscripted at this time, or were they all volunteers?
No, they were all volunteers.
Well, there was a strong recruitment, though, of people who were seen as valuable in some of the military positions that
That's true,
were,
yeah.
you know,
Yeah, but still, it's not the same as conscription, yeah.
it wouldn't have been part of the draft, yeah.
I personally love this question. All these polls you quote about women working, who were the people polled? Were only men polled, or were women polled as well?
Those are always great. That's a great question.
Well, that's what's surprising,
And the
right?
margin of error, please.
I know. I think that it's interesting because those were always polled. So polling really started in 1935. That's some of the first polling that happened in the United States. So we were lucky for this exhibition that was one way we could show about public opinion. But these are men and women across America who are polled. But I think what's so interesting about that question is you see that women held similar views, you know, that was part of the way we saw the familiar, and that's not something you easily go against, you know, until you sort of tasted it. And really the women's movement in the 1960s is the next wave of this. The 50s is a period of what we called normalization, yeah.
What were the provisions that were made for childcare for the women who were working?
None that I know of in Oak Ridge at all, but you could also, there were, as much as there was a huge female workforce in Oak Ridge, there were entire nuclear families that would go to Oak Ridge as well. So for example, if a man were taking a job there, he could bring his family with him. In some cases, though, when there was an economic impetus or that's, again, that sense of duty and opportunity to work. In Colleen's example, she came there, as I said, with about 9 other members of her family. Some of her siblings were still quite young. And so they had this double trailer. There were no bathrooms. You had to walk down a hill to go to a bathroom, take a shower. What they would do, Oak Ridge operated 24 hours a day. The working members of the family would arrange their schedules so that they would sleep in shifts, eat in shifts, so somebody was always there to take care of her younger sisters. And it was, this is not necessarily related to the question, but one of the things that I thought was so interesting about the small children in Oak Ridge, because Oak Ridge itself had a fence and a perimeter that was heavily guarded and often guarded on horseback. And where the trailers were was very close to those fences. And, people like to watch, horses, ride by, and, you walk out, could go into the woods and watch the guards go by on horseback. And Colleen's youngest sister, Jo, when she was about 5, she refused to go when they would go watch the horses go by because she thought the Germans were on the other side of the fence. So that effect, no matter which side of the fence you're on or which side of the war you're on, that just effect of just growing up behind a fence that you're not supposed to go on the other side of.
Denise, you talked a bit about the role of African American women, one in particular, in this program, but also in your book. But this question wants us to dig a little bit more deeply into this topic. To what extent did women of color play a role in World War II? How did their roles differ from those of white women? And this questioner does note that the majority of the film clips and propaganda that we've displayed in this program depict white women. Is that representative?
I can only speak to my experience at Oak Ridge, and their roles were limited in Oak Ridge as well. So you could either be a domestic worker, you could work in janitorial, or you could work in construction. So those were the opportunities available in Oak Ridge. Again, that's what I had so much research to do just on that town. That's what I would speak to, but I would say that it was very clear to me when the first time we saw those clips that it's pretty much, I think I saw maybe one face of color toward the end of one of those clips. So
That's the government
to me,
propaganda.
That's the government propaganda. And when I did my research at the National Archives, the other interesting aspect of the archival research was not just the Atomic Energy Commission papers, but the Fair Employment Practice Commission papers. that really examined, like the letters of complaints that would be sent in from members of the African American community to people, to labor union bosses, to the President of the United States. Really, really difficult to read because they were volunteering to help with this effort, and yet being subjected still to such unfair treatment. And that was actually a very illuminating, difficult part of the research.
Gretchen, I'm going to throw this one over to you. Only 12 states require Holocaust education in public schools. How can American women apply pressure to ensure that every state requires Holocaust education in public schools?
So there are 12 official mandates, but there is a lot of conversation across the country at the local level, right, really in every state right now, about the importance of talking to local school districts, local school leaders, people who are thinking about the education of children, and really thinking to, what I'm trying to say is, yes, there's 12 mandates, but each state is dealing with this issue, with the rise of anti-Semitism, with the rise of violent anti-Semitism. What can we learn from the history of the Holocaust, a period where hatred went unchecked? What can we learn about that, and what can each individual do about that? And what we're trying to do is, we're not involved in thinking about the politics of mandates in a sense, but what we are involved in is creating resources and training for educators who are thinking about teaching about this subject, the complexity of it, how hard it is to do it, and how much responsibility you take on when you think about talking about these issues with students in different disciplines and different grade levels. So I think the question is really, what can all of us do? And I think we have to all be able to share the importance of the history, focus on making sure people who are in leadership positions in schools understand the importance of learning the history, but also in making sure that teachers have what they need and turning them to sources like the museum that have the educational training and resources that they need. So I think the requirements exist at every state. It's how they're implemented and how educators have the opportunities.
We're going to wrap this program up by showing a quote from Eleanor Roosevelt from 1946. And I'm hoping, Gretchen, that you can have some final words here that put this into some context for us.
Related to what I was just saying, even in 1946, Eleanor Roosevelt knew that there were going to be moments where we would look at the sacrifices made by Americans in World War II, sacrifices made by this country across the board, but also that, despite the focus on defending democracy, saving Jews had never been a priority. And so she had visited a displaced persons camp in Europe and seen the consequences of our choices as a country. And she said these words to help everyone think about all of our responsibility, especially our individual responsibility. She said, "I have the feeling that we let our consciences realize too late the need of standing up against something that we knew was wrong. We have therefore had to avenge it, but we did nothing to prevent it. I hope that in the future we are going to remember that there can be no compromise at any point with the things that we know are wrong. The most important thing for us to realize is the great responsibility that lies upon our shoulders." So with that reminder from the true humanitarian that we talked about tonight, we really want to thank you, Kristen, for joining us and having this conversation, and thanks to Denise, and really thank all of you for having the conversation with us. If you'd like more information, you can go to the museum's website, and thank you again to our partners tonight for allowing us to have this space to think about these questions. And everyone have a safe trip.
And thank you to our panelists. Thank you.